All right, we're back for another edition of Bible class, going through the Gospels. A little change of location here because I tried doing it in the Fellowship Hall, but one of the times I went through, I was about a couple minutes into the video, and I had both the furnace and the fridge running. So it was like, no, I can't deal with this like this. So we moved it up here. So the worst you should be able to hear is some road noise of a car going by the church. All right, a couple of questions before we get started that came up. One, before Bible class, was the condition of my poor, miserable coffee cup. Yes, it is one of my favorite coffee cups. It is an Our Savior cup that was made several years ago, but the black plastic on top of it is just rubbing off on it. But I do have other coffee cups. You can see the family there that does it well. And the questions as to how much do I drink? Well, honestly, I take about as big a sip in those moments to pause as most people take from the chalice as they're receiving it at communion. So it's just an easier way for me to signal, okay, this is the time to pause the video and to have the class discussion without just saying, okay, pause the video now, or having to do all the editing of putting in something to say, okay, time for class discussion. Just the easiest way to signal that. So now, on to the questions. One of the questions brought out last week was with the story of the Samaritan woman and Jesus and the dealings between the Jews and the Samaritans at that time. How does that relate to the tensions between Israel and Hamas now, or Israel and anybody in the last almost 80 years that they've been a sovereign state in the Middle East? And really, the story is about as old as time. We can definitely go back to the book of Joshua, where the Israelites come in and are told to annihilate all of the Canaanite tribes. And we go into Judges, or go into the middle of Joshua and the beginning of Judges, and we see that the Israelites grew complacent and didn't get rid of everybody. So you still had some of those tribes that had these foreigners coming in and invading their territory, that still had that build-up and tension between them. And you go on through all of history, whether it's the Assyrians taking out the northern kingdom of Israel and the northern 10 tribes and bringing in a bunch of people and mixing together the populations as the Assyrians did when they conquered, so that no one group was likely to be able to bring up a great revolution against them. That's where the Samaritans came from, is that grouping of foreigners from all over the Assyrian Empire to mix in with the remainder of the Israelites that were left behind. And again, you go on through the New Testament times and the Roman era, you go into the era of the Crusades and the medieval times, and it's just one group after another trying to knock another group out of this area. And quite honestly, it's still going on today. Names change on occasion, but Israel and Hamas are still fighting the same war that's been going on since the days of Joshua. Okay, again, like I said, names change, the extra players in all of it change, but it's still really the same old story over again, is that somebody says, no, this is my land, this is not your land, and you shouldn't be here. That's plain and simple. Most of you know I am not very political, so I'm not going to try to wax well on that, because that's out of my depth, that's out of my comfort zone, and it just really, the biblical answer is one that gives us everything that we need to know. It's just, that's human nature. And especially in that area where there are so many people wanting to say, this is my ancestral homeland. All right, another one that was brought up, especially Wednesday, with the imposition of ashes and so forth is, when did Lutherans start doing this? Because I had a couple of members who, one grew up in St. Louis, one grew up in Chicago, and that was considered by the Lutherans a very Catholic thing. And very much so. But it's also during that time where those generations and the generations before them are the ones who really were the ones who gave up everything to other people. The great words that we could have, the great things that we could do, we gave up because primarily it was too Catholic. Whether it was chanting in the services, whether it was the pastor chanting anything, or the words of institution, as we have in Divine Service Setting 3, the chanting of the Lord's Prayer, or the benediction, things like that. That was all considered Catholic. Well, now you go around to a lot of Catholic parishes, the bulk of them, the priest doesn't chant. A lot of it because, honestly, the priest can't chant and probably shouldn't. But that's my own opinion as one who enjoys chanting and can do it rather well. But ashes on Ash Wednesday was one of those things that was given up as being too Catholic, as being too law-based, and we are people of the gospel. Well, and the Synod on their website has, an answer to that question is that, yes, it is a fairly recent, in the last 20 years, reclaiming by many people in the Missouri Synod. And it is still debated every single Fat Tuesday or Shrove Tuesday or Mardi Gras, whatever you want to call it, is still debated every year on Facebook by different groups of pastors as to whether we should or whether we shouldn't. It's still an ongoing debate. So why do I impose the ashes? Well, first of all, as I stated in the sermon on Ash Wednesday, there are two main reasons. First, the blackness of the ashes reminds us of our mortality, of our sin. That is that reminder of you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The second thing is that it's not just a blob put on there. Like, I just take my thumb, or as I did this year, my pointer finger, and just kind of draw whatever, or circle, or just put a blob on there, like a dot like the Indian people have in their foreheads or whatever. No, it's in the shape of a cross to also show our forgiveness, our redemption, our salvation from that same dust, those same ashes. And the procedure of burning last year's palms to make this year's ashes is an ancient thing that was done, but also a recent reclamation. Because yes, you can go to any Catholic supply store and they'll give you a little baggie. I think it's either it's a sandwich-sized bag that will make enough ashes for 100 people, or you have the quart-sized bag that they advertise as being able to do the crosses for 500. That's great. I mean, yeah, you can get them from the store. You mix them up as you need to, but it makes a greater purpose that as we put the palm branches in our homes to remind us of Palm Sunday, that as they sit there and they do die because they're plant branches, that we take them and we reclaim them into another purpose, bringing them into the ashes, reminding us that as they died, so we also are in the process of dying, so that we link both of those things. Because Palm Sunday is the last Sunday before Easter. It is the last Sunday in Lent. So there, it is very appropriate that we begin the season of Lent on Ash Wednesday, receiving ashes to remind us of our mortality, but also of our salvation. And is there an issue with, there are some Missouri Synod churches that do, some that don't? No, it's an ongoing debate and discussion that goes on because people have different ideas. people want to point out, especially for those who use the traditional Ash Wednesday readings. They get to the gospel reading, and the pastor is standing up there with the ashen cross on his forehead, and Jesus says, "Do not disfigure your faces when you fast." Yeah. There's not really much getting around that. But it is not that we are doing this to show off our faith. Yes, it is to display our faith, that we are beginning the penitential season of Lent. But it's not there as the Pharisees would do, and to try to show everybody just how hard they were fasting, how horribly mistreated they were by themselves and their own self-imposed rules. This is not what the ashes are for. You have churches that, as the church that Renee and I were married in, they were a large enough church where they had a morning service where, yes, a couple of years we went to the morning service, got ashes, and we went off to work and wore the ashes all day. Great. You can have that same thing going on all the time. And it's not a point of saying, "Hey, look at me. Look at the great thing that I'm doing for Jesus." No. That is the exact opposite of what we're doing here. We are reminding ourselves and those who see us, who ask the question as to, what's that dirt on your forehead? Being able to tell them the simple story of the fact that we are dust, and to dust we will return. But it is in the shape of the cross, that reminder as to where our salvation comes from. And that is where our hope also is. All right, so let's get into the lesson now as we get into lesson 8, looking into John chapter 4 and then Luke chapters 4 and 5. As Jesus comes back to Nazareth, he's been out to Capernaum. He's called Peter and Andrew, James and John, Philip and Nathaniel, and maybe some others. And then we get one of the great verses in the scriptures. John 4:44. John has this as a parenthetical phrase where Luke has it as an actual quotation of Jesus. For Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own hometown. I use this verse a lot when people talk about the pastoral procedure as to what it takes to become a pastor in the Missouri Synod. And that you don't have typically people coming back to the same areas that they came from. Which this makes a very great point, is that in other congregations I have put forward some of the, especially the kids that are either, they're going through school right now that maybe have a little bit of a rambunctious tendency in them, and asking them, do you want them to be your next pastor? Can they be your pastor with you knowing all the stuff that they did when they were little? That's hard. That's hard for a congregation. That's hard for a pastor. So that's why that's typically not done, because you have all the stories of what the kids did when they grew up. And when you look up at the pastor as the one who is there to proclaim the word, to lead and shepherd the flock of Christ in this place, you don't want those stories running around in the back of your head. Yes, your pastor has probably done many of those same things, but they weren't done in your presence around you. So you don't have firsthand knowledge of that. But when Jesus comes back to Nazareth, everybody knows who he is, because Nazareth at best might be the size of Wellington. So it's not a very big town to begin with. All right, so we're looking at this. Got a few words that we want to and we need to sit and define for a moment before we get into a lot of the reading here. So the first one, what is it that you think of when you Here, Jesus talking about the disciples. And what is a disciple? A disciple is simply a student. It is one who is learning from someone else. So therefore, we are always called to be disciples of Christ because we are always learning from him. So now, that's a disciple. What is an apostle? Well, apostle comes from the Greek word apostello, which means to send. An apostle is one who is sent. We would think of that as pastors in a sense. They are sent by God to a congregation, which is why we talk about the divine call that a congregation sends out to a pastor. You also have missionaries in that same way, that they are sent to a place to proclaim the word. So apostle simply means sent. Now, here's the real question. What is a Christian? Well, Christian in Greek and in Latin both mean little Christ. That we are to be representatives of Christ, regardless of race, gender, age, that we are to be reflections of Jesus and what he has done in our lives to those who are around us. And it's these things that start to rankle the people in Nazareth as we see in these coming verses. So we start off in John chapter 4. If I can have a couple of people read those couple of paragraphs. All right, so we have, again, him coming to Cana in Galilee. So we look at verses 46 and 47 again. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. All right, the faith of the nobleman was the subject of a sermon on faith by Luther in 1523. The nobleman's faith seems to be based on miracles Jesus publicly performed in Jerusalem during the Passover, as we see in John 2:23 and 4:45. His son was near death. We can assume all other medical means had been exhausted. Some speculation is required to interpret the depth of the nobleman's faith at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. What are some possible interpretations of this man's faith in Jesus? Well, first and foremost, he might just be seen as a miracle healer. If we've got some of the miracles that he performed and the healings that he did, whether in Capernaum or in Jerusalem, or even just maybe this nobleman was at the wedding and found out that Jesus had turned water into wine and is thinking, okay, well, maybe if he can do that, if he can change the molecular configuration of water into something that is nowhere near water, then maybe he can heal my son. In verse 48, the next question, Jesus refers to the man wanting to see a sign, something the Pharisees would demand of Jesus throughout his ministry. At first reading, it seems oddly inappropriate here. How might Jesus' admonition against demanding signs have addressed the faith of this man, as well as the crowd of people? What we have here simply that point is that maybe he is just looking for a sign. Maybe he's just heard about the miracles. Maybe he's not heard a single word that Jesus has taught or preached. And he is just looking for a miracle because he has exhausted every other means that was available to him. That was the great pull of the snake oil salesman, is that if you had tried everything else, this is the cure-all. It can cure everything from toenail fungus to dysentery to whatever ails you. It can all do that. Maybe that's what Jesus is pointing at. This guy is just looking for a sign, looking for a miracle, not because he has any faith in what is going to happen, not that he actually believes that this guy can do it, but that he just wants to see something flashy. He wants something there, concrete, to show that Jesus might be who he says he is. But again, that's also assuming that the nobleman has heard anything that Jesus has said about himself. All right, move on to question 4. In verses 49 and 50, the nobleman redirected Jesus to his son. Jesus told him that his son would live and dismissed the nobleman to return to Capernaum, about 25 miles away, 9 or 10 hours away on foot. What might the nobleman have thought about on the way back home? Well, he's probably put out. That Jesus, he's wanting Jesus to come back with him. He's wanting to see the miracle happen with his own eyes. Why wouldn't Jesus come with him? Why wouldn't Jesus deal with his son? Just say, your son's going to be fine. Much like the snake oil salesman. You take this and you'll be fine. That's probably what he's thinking about. He's feeling hurt by Jesus because Jesus is not doing things in the way that he expects it to be done. All right, next question. Verses 51 to 53 says that the son was healed at the moment Jesus told the man his son would be healed. The nobleman and his household believed. How might this faith be different from the faith he started out with in Cana, particularly in light of Jesus' statement regarding a demand for a sign? Obviously, a miracle worker, in the sense of the way most people think of it, has to be in the vicinity, typically has to be in the same room as the miracle happening. And yet, Jesus heals the son being 25 miles away. You think of that. Jesus is 25 miles away from the son. The nobleman spends the 9-10 hours walking back home, dejected because, this isn't going to happen, because this isn't the way things work. The miracle worker, the healer, has to be in the same room. That's the way healing works. But now he gets there and he finds out from his servants, from his family, that his son was healed at the very moment that Jesus said, your son will be healed. Completely different focus there. This is not just some healer who can take care of things on a local scale, that has to be there in person. This is somebody even better that can do things being an entire day's journey away. This is a very different faith that the nobleman and his household has from one day to the next. Because now they realize Jesus isn't one of these fancy healers that have gone around. There's something more to him. And that's the difference there. We see it ourselves. We're not ones who have had any dealings with Jesus in the flesh standing before us. But we pray for healings. We pray for, different things. And Jesus is in heaven at the right hand of God, which, as Luther's point out, is everywhere because God is everywhere. But we don't have to see him do it. So the nobleman starts to have the same faith that we do, having not seen the things going on, but still reaping the great benefits of it. All right, any other questions or comments before we move into the Gospel of Luke? All right, moving in to Luke. Here we have Luke's telling of Jesus coming back to Nazareth. So if I can have somebody read verses 14 to 19. All right, so we have Jesus. Luke says, returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee. Verse 13, he's in the wilderness with the third and final temptation of the devil. Now in verse 14, he's back in Galilee. And the report is going about him as to the things that he's done. And he taught in their synagogues. So he comes to Nazareth, his hometown, the place that he was raised. And he teaches in their synagogue and gives a great sermon. And all he has to do, and we haven't even gotten to the actual sermon yet. We've just gotten to the sermon text here of the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So if we move on, if I can have somebody read verses 20 to 30. All right, so as I said, great sermon, real short, much like we heard from Jonah a few weeks ago. Today, the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. You have the people who were definitely looking for the Messiah. That was kind of the entire point of first century Palestine, is they were looking for the Messiah because they wanted to shed the shackles of the Romans, which is why the Pharisees taught that the Messiah was going to be this great warrior king like David. But now we have question 6. Why did the people in Nazareth change their hearts from praise to murder? Again, this is that hometown boy syndrome that everybody knows this guy. And they even say, is this not Joseph's son? And other of the Gospels have, isn't this, the brother of James and Judas and Simon? And aren't his sisters here with us as well? We know this guy. Where did he get? He didn't go off to seminary. He didn't go off to study with any of the rabbis. Where is he getting all of this? Is he just making this up? There's where it starts to twinge. Is that we know this guy. This is not the way this guy was. And so Jesus goes on to say, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth, I tell you, this is not the first time. I will give you proof. There were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up for 3 years and 6 months. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath, a town in the region of Tyre and Sidon, a non-Israelite area. That's where Elijah is sent. All right. There were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha in the next generation. And none of them were cleansed, except for Naaman the Syrian, the commander of the enemy's armies. He's the one that gets cleansed. Why? Because this was God showing his mercy. This is God showing that it's not just heaven is going to be for Jews only. Just like heaven is not going to be for Missouri Synod Lutherans only. Heaven is going to be for all those who believe in the promises of God. Doesn't matter what heritage they have in their background. And so, yes, they heard these things. They were filled with wrath. No, we can't have these things. We can't have you teaching these things because that is not right. That is not what we have always done. And so, verse 29 again. They rose up and drove him out of the town and brought him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built so they could throw him down the cliff. I don't know if I want to say that I hope for, or I hope I never have a sermon where you want to drive me out of town. And well, I guess the nearest cliff we've got is throwing me off one of the bridges into Sugar Creek. I mean, we don't necessarily have anything else. But do I or don't I want that? I'm torn between the two. Because, yes, I want sermons that convict you, that point out that, yes, this is for you. It's not for them out there only. It's also for you sitting in the pews. But yeah, I don't necessarily want the reaction afterwards. So, all right, so now we go from Cana back to Capernaum. And go from Cana in John 4 to Nazareth in Luke 4. And now we are back at Capernaum in Luke 5. So if I had somebody read verses 1 through 11. This is very similar as the paragraph says before of what we read in John chapter 1. So we have this in the calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. All right, so we have, again, Jesus calling Peter, Andrew, James, and John as they are in the process of doing their vocation as fishermen, as they are taking care of their livelihood and their families. But what was the purpose? In John 1, we had just Jesus saying, "Follow me," and they left everything. Luke, we have this miraculous catch of fish. What is the purpose of that catch? Well, it's twofold. First, it pointed out that they had been out all night fishing, which is the way fishing was done, because you are not going to be out in the boat in the middle of the day on the Sea of Galilee because it was hot. So you did it at night. And they had spent all night fishing and had caught 0 fish. I mean, 1 fish would have been a massive fish story for these guys. But they had been out all night doing everything they knew to do as professional fishermen. And they caught nothing. So as Jesus has Peter put the boat out a little bit from the shore, he tells him to do the exact opposite of what they have been trained to do, what they have done all their lives. Let the net down into the deep end. No, you trudged along the shallow end because you weren't going to catch anything in the deep end. There was too much room for the fish to swim around and get out of the net. But then that's the question as we look at verses 4 to 6 again. And this is exactly where I was. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. Peter had worked all night. They had caught nothing. But he needed to learn a lesson about his labor, a lesson we also need to learn. How would you summarize the lesson that Peter learns in this catch of fish? Try as we might, things are not always going to go to plan. Think of anything in your life, your work that you have done, raising your family, all of these things. You had great ideas as to what you wanted to see happen, and they all fall apart. I mean, I'll give you a couple examples. One, once we found out that Gabe was left-handed, we're like, okay, we want him to be a major league pitcher so that he can take care of us when we're old and we don't have to worry about anything. Gabe is not my athletic kid. Gabe has, really not much desire for sports at all. So yeah, that went down the tubes rather quickly. Most of you know my background and my bachelor's degree is in computer programming. And we talk about our smartphones. You want to know how smart your phone is? It does exactly what you tell it to do, not necessarily what you want it to do. And we learned this in programming classes, is that yes, you write all the code for it. The computer will do exactly what the code says. And sometimes, many times, you sit there and you have to rework things because you told it to do the exact opposite of what you wanted it to do. Greatest frustration among computer programmers is that, yes, it did exactly what you told it to do. You told it wrong. Now, our smartphones do the same thing. Things don't always go to our plans. As Solomon has in Proverbs 16:9, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. It is that, okay, I have plans, but my plans are also controlled by if it's the Lord's will, as James reminds us in his epistle, that Lord willing, this is what is going to happen. But we always have to understand that it's not because we thought of such a great plan. It's because God said, this is a plan I can use. All right, so question 9 has dialogue, fill in the blank. When Peter began his encounter with Jesus on the lake, his faith was weak. I mean, this is what I see. This is what I know. You can't do that. Peter responded to Jesus' word or call to, blank him, follow. He does respond. God did a mighty work, and Peter's faith was strengthened. He had faith, but that put it over the top. All right, and D, Jesus working to shape Peter into a different man who would blank his church. And I mean, this one is the one that you could go numerous ways, but primarily shepherd. You want to go the Roman Catholic way and say rule? Okay, great. Go for it. Say hi to the Pope for me. But to shepherd, to guide his church. All right, final question here, question 10. In verse 9, Peter and his companions were astonished when they recognized the miraculous catch was God's work and not their own. Have you ever been astonished by God's work? Me, I'm astonished. Not necessarily frequently, but often enough. Is that I will have a sermon that's like, okay, it's a run-of-the-mill sermon. But I'll have somebody come up months, even years later, and tell me how much that sermon that was run-of-the-mill, ordinary. Sometimes I don't even remember preaching the sermon and how impactful that was for their life. It could be somebody who's an occasional visitor, coming back to visit family or whatever, or someone who's in the pews all the time, and that one struck them a little differently. I have no control over that. That is truly the work of God through that. Very much like the miraculous catch of fish, is that many times I throw the sermon out there as like the net going out into the deep end, hoping that it may gather something. And then sometimes I am just amazed and astonished at what God does with that sermon. Are there any final questions or comments before we close for today? Okay, one final question that was brought up numerous times is, okay, what's in the cup? Is it really coffee? Is it something else? Well, I'll let you know. It's not this, although, I really wish it was. But, I'm not doing this at a time where it's evenings. So, the idea of day drinking, well, why not? Cheers, and God's blessings to all of you.